talk about what is ecology part 2. So make sure you have your notes handout. You're filling in the questions as we go along. So let's discuss ecology part 2. In ecology part 2, we're going to talk about energy flow in ecosystems. We're talking about our food chains and food webs, omnivores, carnivores, herbivores, and our producers. So let's talk about the energy flow. Energy in an ecosystem originally comes from the sun. Energy flows through ecosystems from producers to consumers. Producers are also called autotrophs, and they make their own food. Consumers use food by eating producers or other consumers. So producers are our plants, and if you go into the produce section in the grocery store, that's where you will find your fruits and vegetables, the plants. So producers produce plants. Consumers, we are consumers. Anything that we need to eat or use, we are consuming. So all animals, insects are generally going to be your consumers. So let's talk about our feeding relationships. Energy flows through an ecosystem in one direction, from producer to various levels of consumers. Here we have our flower, which is our producer. It produces its own food from the sunlight. Producer is eaten by the caterpillar. This is our first consumer, which is an herbivore. The caterpillar is then eaten by the frog, which is a carnivore. The frog is then eaten by the snake, which is also a carnivore. And the snake is then eaten by our owl, which is also our top level carnivore. So the caterpillar, the frog, the snake, and the owl are our consumers, and our flower is our producer. An autotroph is any organism that can produce its own food supply. Autotrophs are also called producers. Plants, algae, and some protists and some bacteria are examples of our autotrophs. We mainly think of plants. The trees, the grasses, the shrubs, the flowers, those are our plants that produce sunlight, take the sunlight to produce food for all other animals. A chemoautotroph is an autotroph that makes its own food supply by using energy from chemicals rather than sunlight. So we're talking about the bacteria on the bottom of the ocean. There is no sunlight down there, so they have to have some way to make food for them. So they take the chemicals around them and they turn that into energy. Chemo meaning chemical, so these are our chemical autotrophs. Producers, sunlight is the main source of energy for most life on Earth. Producers contain chlorophyll and can use energy directly from the sun. So producers produce sugar, which provides all consumers with energy. We have our different types of consumers. Another word for consumer is heterotroph, meaning hetero meaning different, and they eat something, so they eat something different. So heterotrophs eat other organisms to obtain energy. We have our omnivores, such as humans, eats both plant and animals. Carnivores, such as lions, they eat only meat or other animals. Herbivores, such as grasshoppers, they eat only producers. Then we have our detrivores and scavengers. They feed on dead plant and animal remains, such as buzzards and worms. Buzzards, which generally are referred to as our scavengers, like vultures. Worms are usually our detrivores. We also have decomposers. Decomposers gets energy from breaking down organic matter, fungus and bacteria. Anytime anything dies, fungus or a bacteria will always show up. So if you look and find roadkill on the side of the road, you will find bacteria. If plant matter dies, you will generally find a fungus growing on it. So again, with our feeding relationships, we have a food chain, which is a simple energy path through an ecosystem with 4 to 5 organisms. And then we have a food web, which is a more realistic path through an ecosystem made up of many food chains. So a food chain shows one feeding relationship. The arrow represents is eaten by. So here we would have the grass is eaten by the grasshopper is eaten by the mouse is eaten by the owl. The direction the arrow points is the direction the energy flows. So the energy started in the grass, went to the grasshopper, and then was given to the mouse, and then was given to the owl. Here's another food chain. We start with our sun. The sun provides the energy for the producers. Producers make their own food. Producers then eaten by the herbivore. Herbivore is generally eaten by an omnivore. Omnivores could also eat producers. And then our herbivores and omnivores would be eaten by a carnivore. Anytime any of these organisms die, so it doesn't matter if it's the producer, herbivore, omnivore, or carnivore, when they die, you will find the decomposers. Fungus generally shows up on our plant matter, and then bacteria will show up on your animal matter. A food web shows all feeding relationships in an ecosystem. Arrow represents is eaten by. So what does the owl eat? Well, we would work our way backwards. The owl eats the frog. The owl also eats the snake. What eats the producer? Well, we would start at our producer and then follow the arrow. These plants are eaten by the mouse. This is also eaten by the grasshopper. These plants are eaten by the grasshopper, they're eaten by the rabbit, and they're also eaten by the squirrel. So you just need to make sure you follow the arrows in the correct direction. Here's another food web. Plant is eaten by the goat, goat is eaten by the lion, this goat is also eaten by the jackal, the plant is eaten by the rabbit is eaten by the jackal, rabbit is also could be eaten by the wildcat, wildcat by the lion, and so on. So we have our types of consumers. We have a primary consumer, which is the first to eat, usually herbivores, but can also be omnivores. So here's our producers. We have grasses, algae, and phytoplankton being in our ocean biome. Our primary consumer would be these animals. The grass is eaten by the grasshopper, the algae is eaten by the mosquito larvae, the phytoplankton is eaten by the zooplankton. Primary consumer, meaning first to eat. A primary consumer is then eaten by our secondary consumer. Secondary consumers are usually omnivores or carnivores. And then we move down to our tertiary consumers, meaning the third to eat, usually carnivores. And then we can move down to our quaternary or fourth to eat, carnivore. These are going to be the top of the food chain. Most food chains are never going to be more than 4 to 5 organisms long. We have our ecological pyramids. They're graphic representations of the relative amounts of energy or matter at each trophic level. So we have an energy pyramid, a biomass pyramid, and a pyramid of numbers. Our energy pyramid, as you go up the chain, energy is lost in the form of heat. Only 10% is referred to the next stage. So as we go up, we constantly lose energy because that energy has to be used to perform our metabolic activities. And here's a better representation. So the energy pyramid shows the loss of energy at each trophic level. So plants start with 100% of the energy from the sun. What eats the plant only gets 10% of that 100. So they get that 10% of 10, or excuse me, 10% of 100 would be 10. So our first level consumers would get 10%. Our secondary level consumers only get 10% of this one. So 10% of 10 would be 1. And then our third level consumers only get 10% of this, so they get 0.1%. Here's a biomass pyramid, shows a living mass at each trophic level. So on our bottom trophic level, here's our producers. We have to have a large amount of producers in order to sustain a larger mass of an organism on the top. So as we go up, our individuals will increase in size as well. So we have 1,500 grams of grain can withstand or support 500 grams of chicken. 500 grams of chicken can support 50 grams of human tissue. And then we have a pyramid of numbers, which shows the number of organisms at each trophic level. So here's our producers again at the bottom trophic level. We have to have a large number of organisms here to sustain our primary consumers at this trophic level. And then our organisms generally get bigger, which means they need to eat more. Here we move up to the third trophic level. They look small in the picture, but snakes are obviously much larger than our rabbits, mice, and grasshoppers. So as the organism gets bigger, it needs more food. So these would then feed on these, and then our hawk would feed on these. But what would happen if we took out half of this? If we took out half of this, half of these would die, half of these would die, and we probably wouldn't be left with any of these. So what happens to any of these levels affects the one below it or above it. So if we took out a couple of the snakes, we would have more mice, rabbits, and grasshoppers, but then we would have, if we have more of these, they would feed more on these, so we would have less of the grass. So what you do to one has an effect on each of the levels. Let's talk about biological magnification. So what happens if the producers were sprayed with a pesticide? You want to get rid of that insect, well, those chemicals have to go somewhere, and we call that biological magnification. Increasing concentration of harmful chemicals in organisms through a food chain. So if you look at the images here, if we spray DDT in the water, that chemical goes into our phytoplankton. Each phytoplankton consumes a small amount. Well, the insects will then eat multiple phytoplankton. So however many phytoplankton they ate, they times that by how much chemicals they had. So 800 phytoplankton, well, that gives us 11,600 insects that are now infected. These insects are then eaten by the fish. Well, the fish take the number of insects times the amount of chemical, roughly 34,600 fish are now contain that chemical. The swan eats the fish, so now in the same concept, 92,000 swans will end up being infected with the DDT. So summary question, answer on your handout. What does the arrow represent? Explain the difference between a food chain and a food web. If you spray pesticides to get rid of mosquitoes, what happens to the animals that feed on the mosquitoes?